This video is looking specifically at one of Chris Wallace-Crabbe's poems called The Swing. This poem was written in 1963, so quite early in his career. And of all of the different poems that we're looking at from his collection, this is one of those poems that we would consider to be prose poetry, in that it's not necessarily written in rhyming verse, as are some of the other poems that we will look at. But one of the things to keep in mind with this is the line length is less important than if we were looking at really fixed stanzas and trying to ascertain the rhythm that was being conveyed by the writing. So we'll just make a note of that as well, and we'll start having a look a little bit at the content of the poem as we're going along. One of the really big, points that is being made by Wallace-Crabbe with this poem is about life in general, and that it exists in contrasts as he's swinging back and forth. That's one of the really clear images that comes to the fore whilst we read through it. So let's read through the poem first, and then we'll get stuck into closely analysing what it is that we can see in the language itself. So the swing. On a swing at midnight in the black park, between poplars which are towers of light for a hidden street lamp, and inky she-oaks, my arc is maintained. From lighter to darker I go, from dark to light, but only as ever to return. Here we live in the imperfect syntax of light and darkness, wanting to write a sentence as perfect as the letter O in praise of things. For things exist supremely. All our values cohere in things. The austere prose which could outline the world with a physicist's clarity never arrives. We move through the fugal elaboration of leaves, through centuries of drowning flowers. Unsatisfied, uncertain, I am swinging again tonight in the park. If we look at the very first line, on a swing at midnight in the black park, immediately Wallace-Crabbe sets up, that sort of ominous or dark setting for us. It's almost a little bit unfamiliar, but at the same time, it's also quite suburban in its landscape. The fact that it's a black park, that he happens to be there in the middle of the night. So we've got these two really clear ideas or images that come up straight away in that first sentence. It doesn't give us anything distinct. We know that it's quite dark, and we know that it seems to be some form of suburban landscape where he is. And of course, from his other poems, we know that that's often the case. Then we start to get some more specific imagery coming through in the way that he's chosen different elements of this poem. So, for example, the poplars, to start off with, a traditionally English tree from Great Britain. Right, so they represent England. It's interesting that he references the poplars as towers of light for a hidden street lamp. This light imagery links very, very closely with England, his mother country, and portrays it in a very positive light, if we think of this, the general ideas of light and dark, right? And it links in with all of those different ideas around the enlightened motherland, the colonial empire, and the light that it brought to some of the colonies as they spread out across the world. It carries with it that historical emblem, or that historical image that's really linked with what England represents. So you've got that metaphor very clearly displayed here. And then we see more imagery that lends itself to the setting for a hidden street lamp, but then inky she oaks. So something now which we consider to be a more distinctly Australian tree, the inkiness of it proclaims almost a strangeness for him as the author. It's foreign compared to his understanding of the world from an English or a Great Britain perspective. But what we can see here as somebody who's writing the poem, his arc is maintained. He's fluctuating between these two worlds, this English or British background that is his lineage, and this new home, his identity as an Australian. So he's fluctuating between the two of those. And he says, from lighter to darker I go, from dark to light, but only ever, as ever, to return. So what we are seeing with this arc, with this back and forth, is a bit of a clash of identity for him. Him trying to ascertain who he is supposed to be. You know, he is English in Australia. And essentially trying to ascertain, what does that look like? Who is he supposed to be? And if you think about this time period, 1963, a little after World War II ended, quite a lot of migration happening here in Australia. This identity element was really, really pertinent at the time. It was at the forefront of a lot of discourse and a lot of literature that was coming out of Australia at that time as well. Now, this second verse that he puts in, here we live, we, as in the broader Australian population, all migrants, all foreigners. Oops. He doesn't discount himself as a migrant. He says, here we live in the imperfect syntax of light and darkness. It doesn't quite make sense, is what he's trying to say. Right? We're not natives, but here we are nonetheless. Right? Wanting to write a sentence as perfect as the letter O in praise of things. So he's speaking highly metaphorically here. You know, this is us as an Australian collective wanting to write a new history, wanting to write a sentence. But that's very difficult to do when we have so many different ideas and backgrounds all coming together. You know, for things exist supremely, all our values cohere in things. So it's about bringing all of these different cultures together, is what he's trying to explore with this poem of the swing, going back and forth. You know, what is the Australian identity? How is this all going to look when we come together as a nation? Again, remembering when this was written back in the early 60s. The austere prose which could outline the world with a physicist's clarity never arrives. So now he's actually speaking about himself. And I think in this last little verse, he himself appears with that first person pronoun, just as he did at the start over here. This physicist's clarity, which he's talking about, alludes to his background, his love of physics and his studies of physics. And he's trying to compare the two, trying to compare, I guess, the very artistic form of poetry with the work of a physicist, which is always so precise and grounded in science. He's trying to find the austere prose, the words to describe a world where he just simply can't do that. That physicist's clarity that he so longs for does not arrive because the world is more complicated than that. All right. And interestingly, he stops there. We see in this particular section, as in the other sections as well, the caesura, where he's using it to deliberately pause in between verses. All right. Unlike verse poetry, where we would often be looking at the structure of the lines and the length of the lines and the rhythm of the lines, here the rhythm of the verse as a whole is important. And the fact that he deliberately chooses to use the caesura in different instances throughout the poem to stop the reader as they're going along makes us wonder, okay, why is it that we've chosen to stop at this particular point? Here he's talking about the fact that it just never arrives. We can't pinpoint exactly how this new world will exist or look. And so what he then does is uses more artistic terminology, particularly musical terminology, which he does in a lot of his other poems as well, to show the complex nature of what it is that we are here in Australia. So we move through the fugal elaboration of leaves. There's a few different things here. Fugues are Baroque musical terms. It's a form of composition, and so he's using it in a very metaphorical way here, because fugal pieces are works that contain a multitude of voices that work in harmony together, different voices, each one equally important, but all working together. And so that's how he is describing this patchwork that we have here in Australia as a fugal elaboration of leaves. So let's just make a note of that. And I guess the really important part with that is that they are all equal in a fugue. Each voice is just as important as the other. His other metaphor here that he sort of combines, this dual metaphor of leaves through centuries of drowning flowers. So he moves from a musical metaphor to one of nature and imagery. One of the really interesting things about leaves is that they are all similar, but they're all different and unique at the same time. Through centuries of drowning flowers, here he's linking it through to, colonial history. He's coming back to that idea that he was exploring at the start of himself being a descendant of the English colonies. He's looking at this. We move through the fugal elaboration of leaves, this world of a multitude of voices, all different people coming together, and through centuries of drowning flowers, through centuries of colonial history. So he's thinking about all of these different things as he's trying to pinpoint his own identity. And the way that he feels by the time we get to it, is unsatisfied, uncertain. I'm swinging again tonight in the park. So we have this really nice sense of bookending, if you like, where he comes back to the way that the poem started. but he feels as though he's still swinging. He's still in this sense of motion that's been perpetuated all the way throughout the poem, and so he's not really settled on an identity. He still hasn't quite figured it out. And then is often the case with a lot of poetry that we see, there's no definitive answer that's given by the poet. If anything, he's exploring that uncertainty and exploring how he feels. And so we see that really, really clearly with this poem in lots of very beautiful ways, in the different metaphors that he's using and the imagery that he's evoking, and in that contrast and that clash, not just between Mother England and this new world of Australia, but also of all of the different cultures that are coming together and his part in it and his search for identity. And so that's a little bit about the poem The Swing by Chris Wallace-Crabbe.